Hi and welcome. I'm Kat Sheridan, Ohio Arts Council's Rife Gallery Director. I'm super excited today to share with you one of the artists from Paper Roots, Women to Watch 2020 Ohio. This exhibition is a collaboration with the Ohio Advisory Group to the National Museum of Women in the Arts. It's a really pretty special collaboration that we have with them to bring forward really phenomenal artists that happen to be women. Today, Carmen Romine is going to take us through a little bit of her process, some inspiration, and share some additional work with us. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Carmen.
Hi, everyone. My name is Carmen Romine. Thank you to the folks here at Rife Gallery for inviting me to come here and share my practice and my artistic journey. And thank you for taking an interest in getting to know more about me. To give you some insight into my background, I grew up in Medina, Ohio. It's about an hour south of Cleveland. It's a pretty rural town. I grew up in a ranch house in a family of 5 with an older sister, a younger brother, and my mother was a freelance graphic designer for most of my life and currently runs her own business. And my father was an engineer at NASA for most of my life as a child, which I think also attributed to the fact that some of my most favorite interests when I was younger were art, outer space, and math. And so in 2006, when I graduated high school, afterwards I moved to Cleveland to attend the Cleveland Institute of Art. And in 2010, I graduated with a major focus in fiber and material studies and a minor in drawing. I chose to major in fiber and material studies because I really fell in love with the process of weaving. It's very mathematical, tactile, and I really loved that old technology behind it. And in addition to learning that, we learned other interesting processes like natural dyeing, repeat pattern design, and working with design as well as working in a larger scale and more sculpturally, like installation art. But one of the focuses in our department was choosing materials because of their meaning, but also thinking a little bit more sustainably with your practice and what you're using. This is a detail shot of one of my pieces. I just wanted to keep it up while I read a short statement about my philosophy as an artist. I value the purpose of making material choices as an artist in order to cultivate a sustainable practice and incorporate the subject within cultural history. Learning these mindful approaches to creating work developed the foundation of my philosophy as an artist. Materials matter. For more than 10 years, I've been making abstract landscapes out of unconventional art materials, most of them being natural or repurposed. My work explores waste and questions the intrinsic value of consumerism. In growing up near the country, I'm inspired by memories of rural surroundings and the quietness of nature. I intend to recreate that same quietness to appreciate the beauty in our world's landscape. So I just wanted to show some artists that inspire me and have informed a lot of my practice. These are 2 pretty well-known painters, Mark Rothko and Agnes Martin. Mark Rothko is well known for his simple field color paintings, usually a limited palette, but very abstract and sort of allow you to imagine what you want to in the space of it. And then Agnes Martin, she is an abstract expressionistic painter, but she paints more neutral color palette grid paintings. And something I found really interesting about her work when I did research was that the work itself, she thinks more about these patterns and grids speaking more about spirituality, and it a little more personal in the idea of a pattern is infinite. Tara Donovan, she is an installation artist that works with common everyday materials, but on a large scale. She'll use them in such a large amount that as they become almost like natural growths in and of themselves. Tara Donovan, so the one piece on the left is a stack of straws up against a wall. And then the one on the right is styrofoam cups. Tracy Emin was one of my favorites back when I was doing a little more drawing work and especially working in my sketchbook. She's mostly based as a fiber artist, but she also does monoprint sculpture and installation. But one thing I really liked about her work was that it's personal, confessional, and she takes a lot of risk with showing her emotion in her work. So I talked a little bit about inspiration in the rural landscape of where I grew up. And I currently live in Cleveland Heights and have been in Cleveland since I went to the Cleveland Institute of Art. But I spent a lot of time, especially when I first moved to Cleveland, going to and from Cleveland and Medina, and taking pictures like of open fields off of the roads that I grew up driving down. And to me, it was just like something I did because like it was familiar, but like looking back on it, a lot of these images, and these probably aren't the best example, but they came out a little like blurry, and I thought a lot about the way that we live like in a fast-paced society, and like the idea of a landscape is something that is just moving and you can't really like slow down and see. So I kind of toyed a lot around with that idea in some of my earlier work. So moving forward with showing my work, I'm going to start off by showing some of my earlier work, and then you'll be able to see the different bodies and how they developed into what I make today. For a couple of summers while I was in college, I taught at an art camp in Connecticut. And during that time, I wasn't really able to make a lot of large pieces. So I kept a stack of watercolor paper, and I would do these like quick little studies, just kind of seeing like the motion of the paint, the way that it would bleed together, and then finding a composition within that. And working with unconventional methods like using like a squeegee in the printmaking shop, and drawing, adding like details into the sketches like houses or landscapes. And this is one of the ones that I made large scale. And what I would do is I would explore blending colors. Usually I would limit it to just a few, like 3 or so. But working really with like a large, I would usually work with a large squeegee and let it blend down into the landscape and have the rest of it evolve with the way that the colors would mix. With this one, I was really excited with how it came out because it made me think of, the reason why I titled it Reverse Horizon is because it made me think of, rather than like looking at the sun, what it would be like if you were on the sun looking out into outer space. So it's kind of this idea of like the idealism behind a horizon, but what would it be like if you were there? These are two sound installations I made back when I used to be really into noise music. And just to briefly explain what that is, noise music is usually, it's all digitally based, but and it can be a little bit performative. But how it works is, and I'm not a noise musician, but I had friends who did it and helped me. But how it works is you can place contact mics onto like an object, and then they'll record the sound of what it makes as you're doing whatever mundane activity, like dropping pennies into a jar or whatever it may be. And then what you do is you take that sound and then you loop it over and over again as it fades out. It's sort of into an echo. So for the first one on the left, I did a tiny little weaving, and then I recorded the sounds of the loom and like the heddles and the wood and the metal like clanking back and forth. And it wasn't that big of a weaving. It was a very small one when I was making the sound. But I was surprised to see like that what the end result was when we turned it into sound was it was very harsh and industrial. And I thought it made me think more about a factory and an industry, or the Industrial Revolution. So I titled it Shifts and Breaks because I was thinking a lot about time and the time that you spend, being a manual laborer. And then the other one, the process of being and making. I threw about 30 vessels on the wheel, and I recorded the sound of the water dripping, the slapping of the clay, and like the whirring of the wheel. And then all of those sounds when they were combined together and then layered over and over again, it made this like very like soft and meditative, like ambient noise. And I really liked the way that came out. It like when you looked at the installation, it felt as if you were sort of getting like a little snippet into an artist's studio. So by this point, I was thinking a lot about action and process and materials, and how the way that you make something could also affect the meaning that you're trying to convey with what you're making. So I had gone out and collected a bunch of driftwood, and like the main theme I was thinking about during this piece was survivalism and more of like a primitive technique. So I taught myself how to lash wood, and at first I thought that I was going to build some sort of like weird shelter, and but then as I was putting the pieces together and continuing to lash it piece by piece, the bigger it grew, I really enjoyed the way that it became a metaphor as just a bridge that could be to somewhere else, and not any sort of end product, but just imagining it building over and over again and getting larger. So sometimes you learn that you have to stop when you're making something. This was a project where we picked a common everyday material and we researched everything about it culturally, and all of like the connotations scientifically. And at the time I was taking a psychology class, and I was really interested in the psychological connotations behind the eggshell, like walking on eggshells and it being like a fragile material itself. And so when in my research, I found that, eggs obviously typically relate to fertility, but also the interior of it can relate to the ego or oneself. So I was thinking about that, but then scientifically about the structure, I thought it was really interesting that it was easier to break out of an eggshell then breaking in. And so it was sort of this idea of thinking about barrier, strength, and weakness, but this idea of like suggesting of putting all the pieces back together. So I sewed the top halves all together and then pinned them to the wall, and sewed the bottom halves all together. I'm thinking about the whole being greater than the sum. So by this point, I was exploring a lot with working with unconventional materials, and this was more of an experimentation that I had been doing, but weaving leaves through the traditional process. And so I dyed the warp with cochineal, which is ground up bugs, and collected leaves for like a few months. And I was thinking of it as this sort of like record keeping, but also still in the back of my mind, I think I was thinking about this idea of like making them as like stand-in images of like something that looks like it's just moving. And then after I left college, I graduated in 2010. I took a couple of years off, but I wanted to include this piece because this is one of the first pieces I had made after I kind of took a break from making work. It is framed with old barnwood, and there are, it's little pieces of bark that are sewn together and then slowly anchored to the hardboard as I went along. And this, I think what has helped me with some of my methods has been like trying something that I suppose I think would fail, like with the eggshells, but then realizing it, like if you just break it down into units, and that you can make something work that you wouldn't think would otherwise work. So I was also really interested in playing with the idea of illusion and suspension of gravity. And then also making like a sculptural piece that would just be in a frame. So I wanted to carry that same method over into working with paper. And I had been trying to sew it, tape it, and nothing was working. So I think out of like pure frustration, I just took the paper and dipped it into a pan of glue and put it on the board. And then the next day I came back out and I was so excited to see that it actually worked, and it was like really strong. And it made me think of almost like the way that you would bind a book or pages. And I was super excited because I felt like I learned this method that I could carry over into much larger pieces. So I started thinking about where could I find the paper that I wanted to work with. And I had stopped into the local hardware store, and I was talking to the one guy there, and he actually used to work at a newspaper printing facility. And that was the first thing that he said was, have you tried like talk to people at the newspaper place? So I went to the Cleveland Plain Dealer and found a connection there. He was really great. He gave me this awesome tour, which I highly recommend anyone who's interested in paper, like you need to get a tour of the Cleveland Plain Dealer. They have this whole room that is just like stacked high, like huge rolls of paper. They're all just stacked high, and it's temperature controlled. And then the way that it prints through the machine, it's kind of reminded me of yarn and thread, the way that it works through a sewing machine. It's all threaded up through multiple levels. So I collected the end rolls and I took them home and I made this piece. It's called Tide. And I cut down the paper into like a little over 2-inch strips, piece by piece, wrinkled them all, and then built the frame is made with old baseboards from a house. And then after I glued them into the frame, looking back on it, I think that this piece really led me into exploring the ideas that I was thinking about. And I was thinking about like a metaphorical landscape, like something that is abstract, but referencing maybe an old technology of a book or pages or chapters and stories, and thinking of it as like breaking it down into these units that you would think about something that is suspended in time or place. So this is actually the piece that's behind me, but I wanted to include the images of the work that are here at the show, and we'll take a closer look at them later. But this is called Rhythm, and it is made with outdated cashier printer rolls, and which is really nice to work with because you don't have to cut it down. So I'm going to go through the next few slides just to show you some other examples of paper that I've used in these kinds of pieces. This one is old photo backdrop paper. I really like working with it because it is a little thicker and it makes it easier to make something a little sculptural. So with this, I like playing around with like being able to make negative space, having a little more of a color choice and a color variance. And this one I made, I'm actually getting ready for a show soon. This one I made last month. It is butcher paper, which has this really beautiful pink peach color. This one is called The Dark Sea, and it is made with Fadeless bulletin board paper, which I was super excited to find. I've started now, rather than just relying on repurposing paper that I find, I've started like trying to source new aspects of using paper. And let's see. So I think of my work a lot like I think of it as like being abstract in form, but I also really enjoy making things that are just somewhat representational. Like for this piece, I really enjoy that. For me, it just reminds me of like waves in the water, but if you look at it in person, you can see that it's actual like every piece is separate and it brings a much greater depth. And these pieces are definitely experienced different in person because you can see sort of like a rhythmic movement depending on the point of your perspective. So Rooms to Let is a project that happens every year in Slavic Village in Cleveland. Unfortunately not this year, but so what they do is for houses that are going to be slated to be demolished, they have teams and groups of artists come in and create a whole installation project. It's a nice way to illuminate diverse and interesting neighborhoods, but as well as give the artists an opportunity to make more installation pieces, as well as give the house a proper burial. So for the first day of this project, myself and the other artists that were involved, we walked through the house. It's a multi-family home, and we just kind of like talked about our ideas and maybe like spaces that would make sense for what we would want to do. So I chose to work with the second floor of the master bedroom, the closet, And I chose it for a few reasons, but I chose it because it's a personal space, private space, because a lot of my work is also very labor intensive. I chose it because I knew that I would probably want to work in a pretty condensed fashion and it would be a little more practical. I also really enjoyed that it had this nice natural light coming in from the window. So at the time, I was working nights and they really wanted us to go to the house in a buddy system because it was a vacant house. It wouldn't be safe to otherwise. But most of the people could only go in the evenings or the weekends. So I brought some of my friends with me and they helped me cut the paper to length, wrinkle it, and then I worked from the top down, staple gunning it to the wall. And I really wanted to do it throughout the whole space, but I realized it just wasn't going to work with, because one of the walls was falling apart. So I decided to tear down that wall, which I enjoy the fact afterwards, looking at it, that it exposed the skeleton of the house and really opened up the space a little bit more. And then the final wall, I did a charcoal line drawing, sort of similar to the drawings I usually do in my sketchbook for when I make similar paper pieces. But I was thinking, I titled it Passages because I was thinking a lot about this being like a portal or an extension to like time and place, and thinking about the history that had already been in the house. And I think that the lines all kind of like created this movement within the space. I have worked in the service industry for a really long time, just up until last year. I worked in fine dining for about 5 years. And since I was working a lot with paper already, I was thinking, I had been wanting to try to figure out a way to dye paper. And at this point in time, I hadn't really gotten there yet in my work, but I had already been working a little bit with other forms of receipt paper. So I did a test at home with some of my old receipts, and I found that if I wrinkled them and burnt them with a heat gun and then glued them, it made this really nice, like, interesting texture. So my friends at my restaurant job, they helped me a lot. They kept cups at the server terminals for me. And so anytime they could throw in like scrap receipts or end rolls, they would throw them in there for me. And that's why I called it Transactions, because that's really how this started, working with thermal receipt paper. But more specifically with this piece, again, relating back to that idea of like a blurred landscape or things like moving, but I was thinking a little bit more about like the digital world and like pixelated images. So I cut these down into a little more of like blocky shapes. And yeah, I thought of it as like this landscape. You can't really tell what it is. It's kind of coming in and out of focus. These next two images are also the pieces that are here for the Rife Gallery show. And this one, when I was invited to be a part of it, I was really excited to find in my paper stash that I had a bag of all of the end rolls I had saved from my restaurant job, because using the pink was kind of important to me. I wanted to be able, and it's not as easily accessible because you only get so much out of a roll. So I had set those aside. And the other reason why I titled the piece terminals outside of being from server terminals was that the word itself, terminals, meaning like the end or like an ending, and since they were the actual end of the role. This is the other piece here in the gallery, and it's also a mountainscape. And I think back when I started making a little bit more representational compositions, I was actually thinking of it more in like a pun-like way, like mountains of waste, mountains of transactions, mountains of receipts. I think we all experience that, unless we go more paperless. So a few years ago, I taught an art program for a nonprofit organization called Artworks. And the program was to work with high school students, but have them be your apprentice and teach them sort of like the way that you make art. And so one thing I really like about teaching is I feel like it helps expand your practice, like you're kind of forced to think of new ideas. So I came across this process called eco-printing, and it is essentially a cross between natural dyeing and printmaking. What you do is you use the natural material and through a long heat application process with steam, it'll pull the color and the shape and the pattern from whatever material you're working with. And so again, going back to like my same methods of sourcing stuff, I started thinking like, well, where can I get this much, especially if I have to teach like a group of 10 kids, like I can't go out and collect that many leaves. So I started reaching out to florists, and I found this really great florist in Hudson, Ohio, who she did a lot of events. So anytime she would have like a large event and a lot of stuff left over, she'd call me and I'd come down and pick it up with my buckets. And then in another way that I collected materials was, you know, going outdoors, like all depending on the season, whether I'm getting leaves or try to limit how many wildflowers I'd pick, and saving all of my onion skins in my kitchen. So I guess I really like sharing the process behind work because I think it can be really interesting. So as I worked with collecting them, I thought of it more as like painting, and it's a very time sensitive process because when you get so much, you have to use it like within a few days, otherwise the materials like kind of decomposes pretty quickly. So usually when I get a large batch, I'll prepare it all by pulling the petals off and dividing them by color, and having like this palette ready to go. And then as I work, I usually layer them. I soak, going back to like learning natural dyes in school, you prepare your fibers with soaking them into a mordant solution. So I usually use alum, and then layering them between boards for pressure. And I found that clamping or tying them usually worked better than clamping. But then I also keep a bucket of rust kind of ongoing because it usually helps make the color a little more saturated. And I steam them in a turkey roaster with the rusty water and vinegar for usually about like 3 to 4 hours. Sometimes I do like 2 huge batches, which can be a lot. And I think what I really enjoy about this process, you know, because I think I talked a lot about like landscape, but the excitement of seeing the different prints I can get throughout the different seasons. The most interesting are usually spring and fall. And these are some examples. It shows spring, summer, fall, and winter. And you see that like usually with more like fresh material from the summer, it's a lot more vibrant than like something in the fall that has a lot more tannins to it. So this led me to start a small craft business called Tree Fibers. I really like functional work, and I had always been making a lot of my own books. I usually make my own sketchbooks. And back when I was at that art camp, that's where I learned how to make books. So I decided that I wanted to take these prints to the next level in my process. So these are small softbound sketchbooks. And then what I do usually is throughout each season, I'll print like a batch of prints from each season. And then the ones that don't say prints turn into book covers. And then those cutoffs become bookmarks. And this is an example of a Coptic stitch hardbound book I made. It's sewn with like mixed media pages of paper, and the cover is printed with leaves that I had collected from the Smoky Mountains, onion skins, and I think leaves from Ohio as well. I just wanted to show this picture because when I was making all these pieces, I started vending, and sort of like the next step now, this is a picture of the Hessler Street Fair in Cleveland, but sort of like the next step in this aspect of my work that I want to start doing, and I have done a little bit of, is making custom prints from like special events for people. And I think what's really beautiful about that is remembering like a day through something that, you know, was something as the flowers from that day. But that's the end of my presentation. I just wanted to include, these are my 2 websites and Instagram. And we are going to take a look now at my pieces that are here in Rife Gallery. And so this is the piece I showed earlier, Rhythm. And you can see the depth of the paper that goes into the frame. You see sort of this like movement as you go down and look at the piece. And it's very different when either vertical or horizontal. And sort of like what I like about these pieces is that it's also the light and the shadow that contributes to the way that the composition and it looks and is always changing. And this is one of the thermal pieces, terminals. If you look very, very closely, you can see in some of them I use the actual receipts as well. So you can see the print, and I like that like hidden treasure in the piece. And then you realize the material that it is as you're looking at it. But I usually cut them down into like different shapes, whether they're blocky or triangular, and then allow the shapes and the colors and the values in them to create the line work within the piece. And this is the other piece, Ridgeline. And I've noticed a lot when I make these pieces that there are a lot of different kinds of thermal paper, and you can tell that depending on how much or what kind of thermal paper you have or how much you burn it, it can turn red or a little green. And depending on what surfaces I burn them on, usually I wrinkle the paper, but sometimes I would burn them on concrete and you get more of like a speckly, almost like kind of like outer spacey look. Okay, and now we are going to start the Q&A.
All right, Carmen. So we have one question for you, and it says, thank you for sharing your story with us, Carmen. This has been a wonderful talk. Your artist statement mentions that much of your work examines human interaction with our natural environment, our use of materials and resources we view as disposable, and the spaces we occupy through time. Amid a spring and summer that has seen society slow down, seek refuge in nature, and reassess what's deemed essential, have you found yourself looking at any areas of inspiration differently?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the second last part?
Yes. Amid a spring and summer that's seen society slow down, seek refuge in nature, and reassess what's deemed essential, have you found yourself looking at any areas of inspiration differently?
Yeah, actually, and thank you for such a great question. Yeah, I would say seasonally, I suppose I haven't thought about it as much as seasonally, but I have thought about mostly the paper weavings that I make, and especially I'm being so grateful to be a part of the show right now, because I think that there is this very tactile quality about it that, you know, I think I tend to be someone who thrives in, you know, being alone in my studio, but throughout the time of quarantine, I have never missed like human connection more. And I think that making work that is very tactile, like I think I view my work now differently because yeah, I think like the times that are going on right now, I think we're all kind of leaning towards that. And as far as seasons go, I think that like because of also the pandemic, like the pandemic has kind of slowed down everyone in a weird way seasonally. Like I feel like like the time, like the time that we all feel like we're waiting for something. So I suppose I think a lot about that in my work, but as far as how that's going to change my direction, I'm not really sure at this point.
So much of your work is really process driven, almost meditative. So the hand is very, very important in the work. And these, you know, some of the imagery that you're sharing is really kind of these serene landscapes, but the amount of kind of time that it takes to make them. Can you talk a little bit about how you think about time and your efforts within your work, and how that relates within the concepts you're exploring?
Oh yeah, I mean, I think that's really why I like my work, or why I like making what I make, because again, relating back to weaving, when I fell in love with it, it's such a heavy process, but it's a repetitive thing that you do over and over again. And I suppose that the way that I make my work is also the way that I want to translate that within the piece. So again, like seeing the similar material like over and over and over and over again, and letting it create that visual rhythm that you yourself almost feel like or that is the ultimate goal, is that you feel some sort of meditative quality when looking at it.
That's great, thank you. And from Amy, she'd like to know if you could say more about paper that you're curious about using in the future, or paper-like materials that you're looking to explore.
Oh, great question. Well, I will admit, I did recently, because I'm getting ready for a show right now, I did recently I combined the two ideas of thermal receipt paper into the dimensional pieces. Unfortunately, I don't have an image of it right now, but I made like a whole piece, like wrinkled the paper, glued it and everything, and then I burnt it. And I thought it would look really cool. It didn't. So I mean, but you like, and I did, and the thing is like, one thing I learned about my work, because it is so labor intensive, I try to do little studies beforehand to get an idea if like this is something I want to pursue. The study came out great, but it was a different thermal paper, and with it only being on one side, you really couldn't get that like color saturation. So I would say, as far as paper goes, I haven't thought specifically into any one kind outside of it. I think the recent ones I've been excited about were the butcher paper mostly. But one thing I do really want to still learn is how to dye it outside of like doing the eco printing. Oh, and actually, no, I did think about actually going and purchasing more photo backdrop paper, because you get more color variation.
So an aspect of your work is pretty sculptural.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about how you think about sculpture versus 2D, and why you select to display particular works in particular ways?
That's been really hard, actually, when I do have to submit for things, because I see them, like they're sculptural, but I see them as 2D, because the whole point is that you're seeing a sculpture within a 2D object. It makes it a little more, it wasn't just about it being transportable or more accessible or movable. I mean, that is definitely a bonus of it, but I really liked that idea of blending the two together. And I think that I still would say I see them more as 2D, like sculptural 2D objects. I guess I would say that, yeah.
So to kind of delve into the idea of paper specifically, you touched on it lightly, but can you talk about why you focus so much on paper and work with paper? So why is this your primary medium? Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. I actually think that started, I think it started because I was a fiber major and a drawing minor. So I actually think that it kind of started out of it, like already having a lot of paper on hands. I didn't mention that earlier, but in that small piece that I made, it was like old sketchpad paper. So it started with that, like sort of like accessible materials, but then at the same time, I think that there's so much paper out there because we've relied on it for so long that there's just so many different forms of paper. So you can find a lot of concepts throughout, you know, depending on what kind of paper you're using. And I think that I find it, like, paper to me is more intriguing than using yarn, but I still kind of see it in using like in a similar way. Like I call them paper weavings because that's really how that body of work develops. But I think there's just a lot of cultural connotation behind which paper you are using.
All right. If there was something that you would want to leave with us so far as your work and kind of, I love that a piece of what's important to you is kind of sharing the meditation that you experience in the making of the work, in the hopes that someone will experience that in the viewing. And can you talk just a little bit about you have a lot of macro to micro in your work. And so I know that there's a lot that you're trying to communicate. And would you mind sharing kind of the core messages that if you had to boil them down for your work, what are you trying to get across?
I suppose I would say, like, if I could sum it down into a general way, I would say that it really boils down to wanting to create these meditative pieces that are abstract of the landscape because we live in a fast-paced society. It's not anything, I think, against technology, but I think a lot of my work is about consumerism and capitalism, and feeling like there are things that are more valuable than that. So I would say that that's really like the general idea that I'm trying to get to, even though I have a lot of inspiration coming from different directions.
All right. All right, thank you so much, Carmen, for that great inspirational talk. I feel like I need to go and learn more about fiber. And I think actually we may have had one more question that we can get to. Let's get this one last question, and then we'll sign off for the evening. So that last question is, your practice uses sustainable materials. How do you think about permanence in your work?
Oh, that's been a brain teaser for me for a long time. But I will say, I actually had a conversation with the paper conservatives, or the person in charge of paper conservation, sorry, I can't think of the word, at the Cleveland Museum of Art. And one thing she told me that has always kind of stuck with me is that her job is not to keep it from ever deteriorating, because that is impossible. Her job is to slow the process. And I always thought that that was really interesting, because like, what is the point of keeping this thing forever? Because isn't that what I am actually talking about with my work? Like, what is the importance of permanence? Like, isn't the importance of it lasting like at least a lifetime? Yeah, so I don't know, I think there are ways that you can definitely like make your work more archival, but is everything 100% archival? I mean, I don't know. Are we all going to be around in 100 years?
That's great. Thank you so much. So again, thank you, Carmen, for coming in and chatting with us and sharing your work and your story and the meaning behind your work and some of the process. And thank you everyone that joined us tonight, and anyone that looks at this a little later, we're happy to have you join us there too. Again, this is the Ohio Arts Council's Reif Gallery. Exhibition is Paper Roots, Women to Watch, Ohio 2020. I hope you have a great rest of your evening. Thank you and good night.